At Dad's deathbed, my parents announced they'd left everything to my brother. "You're infertile. No grandchildren for us." I stayed silent. When I revealed my wife's pregnancy and the trust fund revision, they lost their retirement home. My name is David. I'm 38 years old. And at my own father's deathbed, my parents told me they were leaving everything to my brother because I was infertile. Before I tell you how a single piece of paper I held in my hand ended up leaving them homeless and shattering their world, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's a wild story, a long and painful one, and it's important for me to know who I'm sharing it with today. It all started in the quietest room I've ever been in. You know, that kind of quiet that's so loud it hums in your ears, a sterile, pressurized silence? That was my dad's hospital room. The only sounds were the steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, each beat a small victory against the inevitable, and the soft, constant hiss of the oxygen machine. The air had that sharp, antiseptic smell that always catches in the back of your throat, a chemical clean that tries, and fails, to cover up the scent of sickness and failing hope. My father, Richard, was lying in the bed, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen him. This was the man who had taught me to ride a bike, whose hands had seemed so massive and strong when they held mine. Now, those same hands were frail, papery thin, resting on top of the crisp white blanket, threaded with the blue lines of Infertile drip. His booming laugh, a sound that could fill our entire house during the holidays, was now just a ghost in my memory. I managed to get a moment alone with him. My mother, Eleanor, had stepped out to have a firm word with one of the nurses about the temperature in the room, and my brother, Mark, had muttered something about needing coffee, though I knew he was just escaping the oppressive quiet. I pulled a hard plastic chair close to the bed and just sat there, taking his hand in mine. It felt like holding a bird's wing, all delicate bones and skin that felt too thin for this world. I just looked at him, my mind a flood of fragmented memories. Him cheering me on at a little league game, the smell of sawdust in his workshop, the look of quiet pride on his face at my college graduation. He turned his head slowly on the pillow, and his eyes, which had been clouded with pain medication, found mine. For a split second, the fog cleared. I saw my dad in there, my real dad. He squeezed my hand, a flicker of his old, familiar strength. It wasn't much, but it was a jolt. A secret message passed from him to me. His lips moved, a dry, cracking motion, but no sound came out. It was just a breath, a whisper of a word I couldn't possibly catch. But in his eyes, I saw it all. I saw regret, a deep, gut-wrenching, silent apology that screamed louder than any word could. A look that said, "I'm sorry, son. This isn't what I wanted." Then the door swished open, and the moment shattered like glass. My mother walked in, her purse clutched in her hand like a shield. She has a way of taking up all the air in a room, you know? She's not a large woman, but her presence is immense, demanding. She offered me a tight, brittle smile. "Let your father rest, David," she said, her voice smooth as polished marble as she gently but firmly nudged me aside. She took my place, patting his other hand with a practiced air of concern. Mark shuffled in behind her, phone now in his pocket, looking profoundly bored. He glanced at the heart monitor as if it were a stock ticker that wasn't performing well. "Is anything happening?" he asked, his voice laced with impatience. My mother ignored him, and that's when she dropped the bomb. She didn't wait for a better time. She didn't show an ounce of compassion for the man lying between them, the man whose heart was beating out its final, precious rhythm on the screen beside her. She looked right at me, her eyes as cold and clear as ice. "David," she said, her voice unervingly calm, "your father and I have made a decision. We've had Mr. Davies draw up a new will." I just stared at her, my own heart beginning to pound in a sick, heavy rhythm. Mark, beside her, suddenly perked up, a flicker of keen interest in his eyes. A small, smug smile began to form on his lips. "We've decided to leave the entire estate, the family home, the investments, everything to Mark," she continued without a single flinch. "He has given us a grandson, a beautiful boy to carry on the Collins family name. You and Sarah can't have children. You're infertile. The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Infertile. She said it like a verdict. A final judgment on my worth as a man, as a son. It was the distillation of a lifetime of being second best, served up in the cruelest possible moment. I looked at my father, but his eyes were cloudy again. He was gone from me. I looked at Mark, who was now actively trying to suppress a triumphant grin. And I looked at my mother, who stared back at me, her expression a mixture of defiance and finality, as if daring me to make a scene. I said nothing. My throat was too tight to speak. I just stood there, the silence stretching between us, the beeping of the monitor the only sound. She thought she had won. She thought that was the end of the story. But as I stood there, feeling the last bit of warmth from my father's hand fade from my own, a single cold thought echoed in the screaming void of my mind. She thinks she's taken everything, but she didn't take the one thing Dad just gave me, a reason to go to war. The drive home from the hospital was a 20-minute trip that felt like it lasted an eternity. I don't remember the traffic, the stoplights, or any of the familiar turns I'd made thousands of times. The entire world outside my windshield, the trees, the houses, the people walking their dogs, seemed to be moving in slow motion, distant and muffled, like I was watching a movie with the sound turned off. The only thing that was real was the cold, heavy stone of betrayal sitting in the pit of my stomach, and the echo of my mother's words, replaying in my head on a relentless, torturous loop. You're infertile. You can't give us grandchildren. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I just sat in the car for a long time, the engine off, staring at the front door of the house I shared with my wife, Sarah. Our home. It was a simple, two-story colonial, a place we had filled with love and hope, a sanctuary so fundamentally different from the cold, transactional world I'd just been exiled from. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to pull the shattered pieces of myself together, and finally forced myself to go inside. The moment I closed the door behind me, Sarah was there in the entryway, a hopeful question in her eyes. But the question died on her lips the second she saw my face. She knew. She didn't have to ask a single question. Her own beautiful face, which had been filled with so much quiet, nervous excitement lately, crumpled with a pain that was entirely for me. She just opened her arms, and I collapsed into them. Right there in our foyer, with the mail still on the table and our coats hanging on their hooks, I finally let it out. I'm not a man who cries easily. My father had taught me to be stoic. My mother had demanded it. But at that moment, I couldn't stop it. The raw grief for my father, the accumulated weight of a lifetime of feeling second best, the brutal public humiliation. It all came pouring out in a flood of silent, racking sobs. I held on to her like she was the only anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis. She just held me, her hand stroking the back of my head, her own tears wet on my cheek. She whispered, "I'm here. I've got you. Whatever it is, we'll face it." I'm so sorry, David. After a long while, we moved to the couch in the living room, a room we'd painted a warm, welcoming yellow together. I sat there, hollowed out and numb, and I told her everything. Every single poisonous word. I described the chillingly calm way my mother had delivered the news, the triumphant smirk on my brother's face, and the awful, final feeling of being completely and utterly discarded by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. As I spoke, I could see the sorrow in Sarah's eyes transforming into a fierce, protective fire. Her empathy was a physical force. When I finished, she took my hands, her grip firm and steadying. "This is not about you, David," she said, her voice shaking with a quiet, controlled rage. "Do you hear me? This has nothing to do with your worth as a person or as a husband or as a man. This is about them. This is about her cruelty, her obsession with appearances and a name on a family tree. This is a sickness in her, David, not a failure in you." Her words were a lifeline, but the pain was so deep it had dredged up years of old, half-healed wounds. My mind flashed back to my college graduation. I had worked my tail off, juggling 2 part-time jobs to supplement my student loans. I was so proud to be the first person in our immediate family to get a degree in finance. At my graduation dinner, my parents' gift to me was a new briefcase and a lecture about the importance of paying back my loans promptly. 2 weeks later, Mark, who had scraped by with a general arts degree, was gifted an all-expenses-paid backpacking trip through Europe for a month to find himself. My mother had explained it patiently, as if to a child. Mark is creative, David. He needs experiences. You're practical. You need to focus on your career. It was the same story, different details. Mark was the investment in lifestyle and happiness. I was the utility expected to perform and be grateful for the opportunity. It's always been this way, Sarah? I whispered, the old memory making my voice hoarse. Always. I guess I thought that when it really mattered, when it was life and death, I thought it would be different. Then we fight, she said, her voice suddenly clear and strong, cutting through my despair. We don't let them do this. We don't let them write you off. We don't let them win. I looked at her, my amazing, strong wife, and for the first time since leaving that sterile hospital room, I felt a flicker of something other than pain. It was defiance, a tiny, glowing ember in the cold, gray ash of my grief. Just then, as if on cue, my phone, which I'd tossed onto the coffee table, began to ring. I glanced at the screen, expecting it to be my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, calling with her brand of syrupy, insincere condolences. But it wasn't. The name on the screen made my heart skip a beat. Arthur Peterson. Mr. Peterson had been my family's lawyer for 40 years, a man whose integrity was as solid as the oak furniture in his office. He was old school, a man of his word. I hesitated, then answered, my voice still rough. David. His voice was deep and graveled, yet conveyed an immediate kindness. I just heard about your father's passing. I am truly sorry for your loss. Richard was a good man with a good heart. Thank you, Mr. Peterson, I said, my throat tightening at his simple, sincere words. There was a deliberate pause on the other end of the line. David, he said, and his tone shifted, becoming more serious, more focused. I'm calling for another reason, and I hope you'll forgive the timing, but I feel it's a matter of some urgency. As you know, I was your father's lawyer, but before that, I was his mother Cecilia's lawyer. I have a deep sense of duty to her, and to the estate she helped build. And I have to be honest with you, I believe her final wishes are in the process of being egregiously violated. I sat bolt upright on the couch. What do you mean? Your mother informed me last week that your father wished to sign a new will. I met with them both. I had my concerns about your father's state of mind, and about the intense pressure he appeared to be under. I advised against moving so hastily, but Eleanor was insistent. He sighed, a sound heavy with professional frustration. David, your grandmother was a very particular woman. She was one of the shrewdest people I've ever met, and above all, she was fair. She'd seen her own sister get cheated out of an inheritance by a greedy brother-in-law, and it marked her. She always used to say to me, Arthur, character is more important than bloodline. Blood can run thin, but character is eternal. She built specific safeguards into the family trust she established. Safeguards I think your mother has either forgotten about or perhaps has chosen to willfully ignore. A trust? My head was spinning. I knew my paternal grandmother, Cecilia, had left my father some money in stocks, but I had no idea it was a formal trust with specific, legally binding rules. My mother always talked about the family wealth as if she and my dad had built every penny of it from scratch through their own hard work. I think, Mr. Peterson continued, his voice low and conspiratorial, it would be extremely wise for you to find any evidence you can of this undue influence we lawyers talk about. Any proof that your father was not in his right mind or was being actively coerced when he signed that new document. Do you understand what I'm saying, son? Suddenly, the image of my father's eyes, clear for just that one split second, flashed in my mind. The regret, the silent, desperate apology. He hadn't wanted this. My mother had forced his hand. A cold, hard certainty settled in my gut, displacing some of the grief. I looked at Sarah, who had been listening to the speakerphone, her eyes wide with a dawning, fierce light. I nodded, even though Mr. Peterson couldn't see me. Yes, Mr. Peterson, I said, my voice now steady and clear. I understand completely. When I hung up the phone, the world felt different again. The grief and humiliation were still there, like a deep bruise, but now they were mixed with something else. Cold, sharp-edged resolve. A mission. Sarah saw the change in my face instantly. She put her hand on my cheek. What is it? I told her everything Mr. Peterson had said. I told her about the trust, the safeguards my grandmother had built, and the hint of a hidden battle we could actually fight and win. Her eyes lit up, not with greed, but with a powerful, unwavering sense of justice. This wasn't about the money. It was never just about the money. This was about the lie my entire family history was built on. It was about honoring my father's final, silent wish. It was about fighting for my own worth, the worth my mother had tried to strip from me with a single, cruel sentence. I stood up and started pacing the living room, my mind, the mind of a financial analyst, suddenly kicking into high gear. I was used to finding patterns, to analyzing data, to building a case based on facts. This was no different. It was a hostile takeover of my life, and I needed to mount a defense. A plan was beginning to form, a risky and audacious one. I wasn't a spy or a detective, but I knew I had to get back into that house. I had to find proof. I had to get my own data. I stopped pacing and looked at Sarah. The love, the belief, the warrior spirit in her eyes gave me all the strength I needed. This wasn't my fight alone. It was ours. They wanted a quiet war. Sarah? I said, my voice low and determined, the words tasting like steel in my mouth. They're about to get one. The next morning, I picked up the phone and called my mother. It was one of the hardest calls I've ever had to make. I had to swallow every ounce of my anger and pain, and force my voice into a tone of subdued, believable grief. I told her I was struggling, that I needed to come by the house to pick up a few of my father's personal things. Some old books from his study, the fly fishing gear he loved, maybe a few photo albums. I said it would help me feel close to him. It was the perfect excuse, playing right into her narrative of me as the sensitive, wounded son. Of course, David. Of course, she said, her voice dripping with a false, saccharine sympathy that made my stomach turn. Take all the time you need. The house is your home too, you know? The lie was so blatant, so effortless, it took my breath away. She probably pictured me as a beaten dog, crawling back to sniff around the edges of the life I'd been kicked out of. She had no idea I was a wolf, returning to the scene of the crime to gather my evidence. Before I drove to their house, I made a stop that felt both surreal and necessary. I went to a big-box electronics store. I felt completely out of place, a man in a business suit standing in an aisle full of spy gadgets and home security cameras. I was a numbers guy, a man who spent his days immersed in the logic of spreadsheets and market analyses. But as I picked out a tiny, voice-activated audio recorder, no bigger than a sugar cube, I felt a strange sense of focus settle over me. This wasn't about emotion anymore. This was about collecting data. This was about finding the one piece of irrefutable proof that would validate everything I knew to be true. Walking into my childhood home felt different this time. The memories were still there, layered like dust on the furniture, but now they were tainted. The air was thick with unspoken words and years of simmering resentment. My mother hovered for a bit as I entered, her face a perfect, carefully constructed mask of a grieving widow. She pointed out a few photo albums on the coffee table. Look, David, here's that picture from our trip to the Grand Canyon. You and Mark had so much fun. She was trying to sell me a version of our family history that had never really existed. But her eyes were restless, constantly darting around the room, already measuring walls for new paint, mentally replacing my father's worn, comfortable furniture with something more modern, more her. I finally managed to get away from her, saying I wanted to spend a few moments alone in my father's study. That room had always been his sanctuary, the one place in the house that felt truly his. It still smelled of him, a comforting mix of old books, pipe tobacco, and the faint, woodsy scent of his aftershave. My heart ached as I looked at his worn leather armchair, the one with the permanent impression of his body, and the desk where his papers still lay in neat stacks. This was the room where he'd patiently taught me how to do my taxes, where he'd helped me write my college application essays, back in the days before my mother's influence had completely overshadowed his own quiet wisdom. My fight, I realized, was for him as much as it was for me. My hands were trembling slightly as I took out the tiny recorder. I felt a pang of something that felt like guilt. This was a violation. This was my family's home. But then I remembered my mother's cold eyes and my brother's smug smile, and the guilt vanished, replaced by a steely resolve. I found a spot for the recorder on the underside of a heavy oak bookshelf, tucked deep in the shadows, its tiny microphone aimed directly at my father's armchair. I knew my mother would be in here soon. This was the nerve center of the house, where she'd be making calls, handling the estate, cementing her victory. I just had to hope she'd get careless. I had to hope her arrogance would make her talk. And it did. Over the next 2 days, I made excuses to drive by the house, parking a block away, the small receiver in my car picking up the signal from the bug. Most of what I heard was mind-numbingly boring, long, rambling calls to the caterer for the funeral, conversations with her friends where she performed the role of the tragic, brave widow to perfection. I was starting to lose hope. But then, on the second afternoon, I hit the jackpot. I heard her on the phone with my Aunt Carol, her sister and chief confidant. With Carol, my mother's mask came off. He was just so stubborn, Carol, even at the end. My mother's voice complained, all the fake grief gone, replaced by pure, uncut irritation. Lying there, barely conscious, and still babbling on about being fair to David. Fair. Can you even imagine? What has David ever done for this family? He couldn't even do the one thing a son is supposed to do, give us a proper family, a grandson to carry the name. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My own son, my unborn child, was already a real person to me and Sarah. A tiny miracle we prayed for every night. To her, he was nothing. I finally had to spell it out for him, she continued, her voice turning hard as steel, an ugly, triumphant edge to it. I told him, Richard, do you want our legacy, everything we have worked for, to just die out? To go to nothing? Mark has a son, a beautiful boy. David has nothing. He is nothing. Honestly, it was for his own good. I had to practically hold his hand to make him sign the papers from the lawyer. He was so weak, so sentimental at the end. It was pathetic. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. I fumbled for my phone and hit the record button, capturing the audio from the receiver. It was damning. It was cruel. It was everything Mr. Peterson had said I would need. It was the ugly, unvarnished truth, in her own words. That night, sleep was impossible. The recording played in my head, a toxic loop of my mother's voice. To escape it, my mind kept drifting back to another sterile, quiet room. A doctor's office. I found myself reliving, in excruciating detail, the whole agonizing journey of our infertility. It wasn't one moment. It was 100 small, painful moments. It was the strained optimism in the waiting room, trying not to look at the other couples. All of you united in the same silent, desperate hope. It was the invasive procedures, the clinical coldness of the equipment, the feeling of your bodies being reduced to a set of biological problems. It was the carefully timed injections that Sarah had to endure, the hormonal swings that left her exhausted and weepy. It was the 2-week wait after every treatment, a period of suspended animation where you couldn't help but get your hopes up, imagining a different future. And then the crushing disappointment. The phone call with the nurse, her voice full of professional pity. I'm sorry, the test was negative. The gut punch feeling. The way you have to hold it together for your partner, putting on a brave face while your own heart is breaking. I remember holding Sarah as she sobbed after one particularly brutal failed IVF cycle, feeling so helpless, so utterly useless as a husband. And right in the middle of our private hell, my mother would call. Her timing was always uncanny. I remember one call vividly. We'd just gotten home from that failed cycle. Sarah was in the bathroom, the sound of the shower barely hiding her tears. My phone rang and it was my mother. She didn't ask how we were. She never did. She just launched into a 20-minute breathless monologue about how brilliant her grandson was, how he was already showing signs of being a genius, how he was the future of the Collins family. I just stood there in our kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to her talk about the grandchild she had while I was mourning the one we might never have. That was my mother, completely and totally oblivious to my pain, completely and utterly absorbed in her own narrative of success and legacy. The funeral came and went in a gray, sorrowful haze. I played the part of the grieving son because I truly was. I was grieving the father I once had, the man he was before my mother's influence had eroded him. And I was grieving the family I now knew was a complete and utter sham. After the service, back at the house, a crowd of mourners was still milling around, eating catered sandwiches and sharing hushed, respectful memories of my father. My mother, ever the opportunist, pulled me aside into the den. She held out a pen and a document, folded neatly into thirds. "David," she said, her voice low and urgent, conspiratorial. "This is just a formality. Mr. Peterson prepared it. It's a simple waiver, a legal form stating that you accept the terms of the will and that you won't make any future claims. It will just make the whole process so much simpler and faster for everyone." I looked at the paper, then back at her. Her eyes had a glint in them, a mixture of anxiety and sheer, unadulterated entitlement. She thought I was broken. She thought I was the same son who would do anything to keep the peace. She thought I would sign it without a thought, just to make the pain and the awkwardness go away. For a split second, I was tempted. Oh God, I was tempted. I could sign the paper, walk away from all of it, and never look back. I could build my life with Sarah, free from their poison forever. But then I thought of my father's hand in mine. I thought of the grandmother I'd never really known, the woman who believed in character over bloodline. And I thought of the tiny, flickering life that Sarah was secretly, miraculously carrying inside her. A life we hadn't dared to tell anyone about yet, terrified that something might go wrong after so much heartbreak. This baby deserved better. This baby deserved a father who fought for what was right. I looked my mother straight in the eye. "No," I said. It was just one word, spoken quietly, but it landed in the space between us like a thunderclap. "What did you say?" she hissed, her mask of maternal grief slipping to reveal the cold fury underneath. "I said no," I repeated, my voice as calm and steady as I could make it. I took the folded paper from her hand and put it in my inside jacket pocket. "I'm not signing anything until my own lawyer has had a chance to review it." I paused, letting the words sink in. "I'll be in touch." I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving her standing there in the middle of the den, her face a storm of disbelief and rage. For the first time in my 38 years of life, I wasn't playing by her rules. The war wasn't quiet anymore, and I had just fired the first real shot. I didn't stop walking until I was in my car. I drove straight from that house of lies to Mr. Peterson's office and gave him the recording. The game was on. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. It was a tense, unnerving quiet, like the eerie calm you hear about before a hurricane makes landfall. On the surface, nothing was happening. We were all just waiting for the date Mr. Peterson had set for the official reading of the will and the trust documents. But underneath that placid surface, a storm was brewing, armies were moving into position, and I was standing right in the eye of it. My mother and Mark made no attempt to hide their glee. They were acting as if the money was already in their bank accounts, as if the legal proceedings were a mere formality. One afternoon, about a week after the funeral, I had to drop off a box of my dad's old financial records at the house for the estate settlement. Mr. Peterson had advised me to comply with all normal requests, to not give them any reason to suspect what was coming. As I pulled up to the curb, I saw Mark's shiny new BMW, a recent purchase, parked in the driveway. A large van from a high-end landscape architecture firm was parked behind it. I saw them in the backyard. Mark was laughing with the architect, a man in a polo shirt holding a clipboard. Mark was pointing and gesturing expansively, like a king surveying his domain. "And the new pool will go here," I heard him say, his voice carrying on the quiet afternoon air. with a waterfall feature, and the outdoor kitchen over there. He saw me getting out of my car, and his smile tightened for a fraction of a second before he gave me a condescending little wave, a dismissive flick of the wrist. I just gave a curt nod and went to the front door. The house was already being stripped of my father's personality. My mother had been ruthlessly efficient. His favorite armchair in the living room was gone, replaced by an empty space that felt like a missing tooth. The walls were dotted with spackle marks where his old landscape paintings used to hang. In their place, my mother had taped up fabric swatches and pages torn from interior design magazines. She was planning a complete overhaul, a sleek, modern, impersonal style that was the opposite of everything my father had loved. She wanted to erase every trace of him that wasn't to her taste, to turn his home into her trophy. I found her in the kitchen on the phone, talking loudly to one of her friends from the country club. "Oh, it's just been a dreadful time, Margaret," she said, her voice a perfect imitation of a tragic, put-upon widow. "But at least I have Mark. He's been such a rock. He's ready to step up and take charge of the family legacy. It's such a relief, to have at least one son who isn't a complete and utter disappointment." I stood there in the hallway, holding a heavy box of my dad's old life, and listened as she assassinated my character with casual, practiced cruelty. A month ago, those words would have felt like a knife in my gut. But now they didn't even hurt. They were just data. More proof. More fuel for the fire that was now burning steadily inside me. A few days later, a strange thing happened. I ran into our old neighbor, Mrs. Miller, at the grocery store. She was a sweet, kindly woman in her 70s, with a halo of white hair and eyes that had always been full of warmth. She had known me since I was a boy, and had always slipped me extra cookies when I came over to play with her dog. She rushed over and gave me a hug that felt genuine and comforting. "Oh, David, honey, I was so sorry to hear about your father," she said, patting my arm. "He was a lovely man, just lovely." We chatted for a minute about the weather, the usual small talk. But then she hesitated. She glanced around the aisle, as if to make sure no one was listening, and her expression grew serious. "David," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I don't want to stir up trouble where it isn't wanted, but I have to tell you something. The day before your father passed, I was out in my garden. My rose bushes are right up against the side of your parents' house, right by their bedroom window." She took a deep breath, her eyes clouded with remembered distress. "I heard your mother. Dear Lord, David," she was shouting at him. "Really terrible things. I couldn't hear it all, but I heard her say his sentimentality was a weakness, and that he was letting everyone down. She was going on and on about you not having children." My heart seized in my chest. This was it, an independent witness. "He sounded so tired, David," she continued, her own eyes welling up. "His voice was so weak. He just kept saying, 'It's not right, Eleanor. What you're doing is not right.' I felt so awful listening, but I couldn't help it. I wanted to go over and do something, but, well, it's not my place." "Mrs. Miller," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't hide. "It is your place. Thank you. Thank you for telling me this. It means more to me than you could ever possibly know." I asked her if she would be willing to speak to a lawyer, just to tell him what she'd heard. She looked frightened for a second, then her face firmed with resolve. "For your father? Yes, dear. I would." But the pressure of it all, the weight of the secrets I was carrying, was immense. The biggest secret, of course, was the one I shared only with Sarah. Every day, I'd come home from work, and the first thing I'd do is walk over to her and gently put my hand on her still flat stomach, as if I could physically shield the tiny life growing inside from the ugliness of the world. It was a life we'd fought for, cried for, and prayed for 7 long years. After so much heartbreak, we'd finally had a successful round of IVF. But we were still in the first trimester, that fragile, uncertain stage where anything could go wrong. We hadn't told a soul. We were terrified of jinxing it, terrified of having our hearts broken one last time after they'd been glued back together so many times before. This baby was our precious, fragile secret. And it was also my secret weapon. One evening, about a week before the meeting at Peterson's office, the stress finally boiled over. I was sitting at our kitchen table, staring blankly at a stack of bills from the fertility clinic, a stark, six-figure reminder of how much we had already sacrificed. The initial retainer for Mr. Peterson was also sitting there, another hefty sum. The financial reality of the war I was about to wage was setting in. Sarah came and sat down across from me. She looked at my face, at the way I was just staring into space, and saw the exhaustion, the fear. "David," she said softly, her voice gentle but firm, pulling me out of my trance. "Talk to me. I'm scared." I looked up at her, surprised. She was always so strong, my rock, the one who never wavered. "I am," she repeated, her voice trembling just slightly. "I am so scared. What if this doesn't work? What if Peterson is wrong about the trust? What if your mother's lawyers find a way to tear it all apart? They'll bury us in legal fees, David. They'll paint you as a greedy, bitter son who is trying to steal from his own grieving mother. They'll drag our names through the mud. And what if we go through all of this and we lose? We've already lost so much. What if we end up with nothing? No family, no inheritance, and mountains of debt, just as our baby is about to be born." Her fear was my fear. Every single doubt I'd been trying to push down, spoken out loud. For a terrifying second, I let myself imagine that future. A future where my mother and brother won, where they were laughing in their newly renovated mansion, and Sarah and I were left broken, with nothing but pain and debt. The thought was suffocating. I reached across the table and took her hands. They were cold. "Hey, look at me," I said, waiting until her worried, beautiful eyes met mine. "This isn't about the money anymore. It's not. If we end up with nothing, we will still be okay. Because we have each other. We have this." I gestured to her stomach, a small, hopeful curve that was just beginning to show. "This is what matters. This is the only thing that matters. But I have to do this, Sarah. I have to see this through. For my dad. For his mother, Cecilia. For us. Cannot let them just erase me. I can't let them define our child's family by their brand of poison. I'm not fighting for an inheritance. I'm fighting for our future." A tear rolled down her cheek, but she nodded, her grip on my hands tightening with renewed strength. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, we're in this together. To the end." That moment was the turning point for me. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. It was about drawing a line in the sand and defending the future of the new family we were building. The date for the reading of the will was set. The calm was about to end. The storm was here. The day of the meeting arrived gray and overcast. The sky a perfect, bruised mirror of the mood in my heart. The proceedings were set for 2 p.m. at Mr. Peterson's downtown law office. His conference room was an imposing space, lined with leather-bound legal books and dominated by a long, polished mahogany table that felt as big as an aircraft carrier. As I straightened my tie in the reflection of the elevator doors, I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. It was the calm of a soldier before a battle he has spent his whole life, in one way or another, preparing for. Sarah stood by my side, her hand resting protectively on her lower abdomen. She was wearing a simple, elegant blue dress. She was now 14 weeks along, and for the first time her pregnancy was just slightly but unmistakably visible. It was a small, hopeful curve that announced to the world that our lives were changing. She was my visible proof, my living, breathing secret weapon. She squeezed my hand. "Ready?" she asked, her voice a quiet anchor in my swirling emotions. "As I'll ever be," I said, mustering a smile that I hoped looked confident. We walked into the conference room, and they were all already there, arranged on one side of the table like a hostile jury. My mother, Eleanor, was dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit, looking every bit the powerful, grieving matriarch. My brother, Mark, sat beside her, looking smug and impatient, bouncing his knee, already mentally spending his inheritance on sports cars and designer watches. My Aunt Carol was there for moral support, her eyes glittering with a vulture's unseemly curiosity. And seated next to my mother was a man I didn't recognize. A sleek, sharp-looking lawyer in his 40s with a shark smile. Of course, she had brought her own legal muscle. This was Mr. Davies. The air in the room was thick with tension, a silence so heavy you could feel it pressing on your skin. When they saw Sarah, a flicker of confusion crossed my mother's face. Her eyes darted to Sarah's stomach for a fraction of a second, a tiny furrow in her brow, but she dismissed it just as quickly, her mind too focused on the imminent victory and the vast fortune she believed was now hers to control. Sarah and I took our seats on the opposite side of the table, with Mr. Peterson at the head. He gave me a small, reassuring nod. In front of him were several stacks of folders, a neat and orderly arsenal. My mother's lawyer, Mr. Davies, spoke first, his voice as smooth and polished as the table between us. "Thank you all for coming," he began, opening a thin folder with a confident flourish. "We're here to execute the final will and testament of Richard Collins, signed on October 12th of this year. It's a very straightforward document, quite clear in its intentions." He paused for dramatic effect, letting his gaze sweep over us. "With the exception of a few minor personal effects, the entirety of the estate, including all property, stocks, bonds, and liquid assets, is to be bequeathed to his beloved and only son, Mark Collins." He made a point of saying only son while looking directly at me, a deliberate petty cruelty. Mark sat up a little straighter, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. My mother looked serene, victorious, a faint, satisfied smile touching her lips. Mr. Davies slid the will across the table towards Mr. Peterson. "If everyone is in agreement, we can proceed with the execution of the—" "I'm not in agreement," Mr. Peterson said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room's smug atmosphere like a surgeon's scalpel. The room went silent. Mr. Davies looked genuinely annoyed, his professional composure ruffled. "Excuse me, Mr. Peterson?" I said. Mr. Peterson repeated, his gaze locking onto my mother. "We are not in agreement. We are formally contesting the validity of this will on the grounds of undue influence and a clear lack of testamentary capacity on the part of Mr. Richard Collins at the time of signing." Davies let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. "That's a very serious accusation, Peterson. A desperate and baseless one. I was there. Richard Collins was of sound mind." "Was he?" Mr. Peterson asked softly. He reached into one of his folders and slid a small, digital audio recorder onto the center of the table. A hush fell over the room. He pressed a button. My mother's voice, sharp and cold, filled the silent conference room, babbling on about being fair to David. Fair. Can you even imagine? I had to practically hold his hand to make him sign. It was pathetic. The color drained from my mother's face. She looked as if she'd been slapped, her mouth opening and closing silently. Mark stared at the recorder as if it were a venomous snake, his smugness evaporating into pure, slack-jawed shock. Davies's confident smile was completely gone, replaced by a look of abject horror. His client had just confessed on tape. "That recording," Mr. Peterson said into the ringing silence, "along with sworn testimony from a nurse and a neighbor who overheard similar conversations, proves that Richard Collins was being actively and relentlessly coerced by his wife, a person in a primary position of trust, during a time of extreme physical and emotional vulnerability. Therefore, this will," he tapped the document Davies had so proudly presented, "is worthless." Davies, recovering slightly, started to sputter. This is an outrage, an illegal recording, an invasion of privacy. It proves nothing. It's circumstantial." "Oh, but it doesn't really matter in the end, does it?" Mr. Peterson said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. He opened a much older, thicker folder. The paper inside was yellowed with age, the typewritten words faded but clear. "Because this will was never the governing document of the most significant family assets anyway." He looked around the table, letting the suspense build. What Eleanor conveniently failed to remember, and what Mark here never knew, is that more than 60% of this family's net worth originated not with Richard, but with my first client in this family, Cecilia Collins. Richard's mother. In 1985, she established the Collins Family Revocable Trust. And a trust, as you well know, Mr. Davies, supersedes a will. He slid a heavy, bound copy of the trust document in front of the stunned lawyer. Please turn to Article 4, Section B. It's the distribution clause. I'll read it aloud for the benefit of all present. It states that upon Richard's death, the trust's assets are to be divided equally among all of his then-living children. He paused, looking up from the page, his eyes twinkling for the first time. And I quote, "An equal share shall also be set aside for any of his grandchildren, born or in utero at the time of his passing." It was at that exact moment that I reached over and placed my hand on Sarah's stomach, a deliberate, unmissable, protective gesture. The penny dropped. The full, catastrophic implication of those words hit everyone at once. Aunt Carol gasped audibly. "No," my mother whispered, shaking her head in frantic denial. "No, he doesn't have, they can't." "Actually," I said, speaking for the first time, my voice ringing with a clarity and strength I didn't know I possessed. "We can. And we are. Sarah is pregnant. We're having a baby in the spring." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum. Mark looked like he'd been physically punched in the gut. All the color was gone from his face, replaced by a pasty, greenish hue. The vast fortune he'd been counting on had just been slashed by more than half, and a portion of it was going to a child he never knew existed. But it was my mother's reaction that I will never, ever forget. The carefully constructed mask of the grieving widow, the powerful matriarch, it didn't just slip. It shattered into 1,000 pieces. Raw, ugly, narcissistic fury contorted her features, making her face almost unrecognizable. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She pointed a trembling, accusing finger at me. "You!" she shrieked, her voice a venomous, piercing hiss that echoed in the quiet room. "You did this. You planned this. To your own mother. After everything I did it for this family, to protect its legacy from a failure like you. A son who couldn't even give me a grandchild. He didn't deserve it. Mark deserved it. It was his right." Her own lawyer, Davies, was trying to silence her, whispering urgently, "Eleanor, stop. Sit down. Do not say another word." But she was beyond reason, lost in her own storm of rage and thwarted entitlement. Mr. Peterson just sat there, watching her, his expression grim and steady. When her tirade finally ran out of steam and she stood there, panting, her chest heaving, he waited a beat. Then he spoke, his voice low and devastatingly final. "Thank you for that confirmation of your intent, Eleanor," he said. "Your outburst has just clarified your motives beyond any legal doubt." He turned a page in the heavy trust document. "And it has also, I'm afraid, triggered Article 7, Section C." He looked directly at her, his eyes holding not a shred of pity. "Your grandmother was a very wise woman. As I mentioned, she had seen families torn apart by greed. She was worried that someone might one day try to manipulate the family for their own selfish ends. So she had me add a special provision. We lawyers sometimes call it a morality clause. More formally, it is the integrity of the trust clause." He adjusted his glasses and read from the page. "It states that any beneficiary who takes deliberate, malicious, or fraudulent action to unjustly deprive another beneficiary of their rightful share shall thereby forfeit all of their own personal benefits, rights, and privileges from the trust." He let the words hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. "That forfeiture includes," he said, delivering the final, fatal blow, "the lifelong right to live in the family home. The home which is, and has always been, the primary asset of the Collins Family Trust." He closed the heavy folder with a soft, final thud that sounded like a gavel. "You're not just losing a portion of the money, Eleanor. You and Mark are losing the house. Per the terms of the trust you just violated, you have 30 days to vacate the premises." The end. The war was over, and I had won. The aftermath of that explosive meeting in Mr. Peterson's office wasn't a single, loud bang, but a slow, crushing collapse, like a building imploding in on itself. The legal machine, once set in motion with such clear and damning evidence, was swift and merciless. Mr. Peterson, true to his word, filed an immediate injunction to freeze the trust's assets, preventing my mother or Mark from touching a single cent. He then petitioned the probate court to enforce the trust as written. The verdict, when it came a few weeks later, was a foregone conclusion. The trust was ironclad. The new will was invalid. The forfeiture of my mother's benefits, due to her own confessed actions, was upheld. The first official notice arrived at my childhood home a week after the meeting. It was a formal, legally binding letter from the court-appointed trustee, stating that the property at 125 Elm Street was an asset of the Collins Family Trust and that its current unauthorized occupants, Eleanor and Mark Collins, had precisely 30 days to vacate. I didn't see it happen, but I heard about it later from a cousin who had tried to check in on them. I heard that my mother simply crumpled. For days, she apparently refused to believe it was real. She was in a state of complete denial, making frantic, hysterical calls to her lawyer, Mr. Davies, who I imagine had the deeply unpleasant task of telling her, over and over, that her own words in that conference room had sealed her fate. There was no appeal. There was no loophole. She had confessed her intent to defraud me, and in doing so, had triggered the very clause my grandmother had designed to stop someone exactly like her. She had, in essence, evicted herself. The 30 days passed. I made a conscious choice to stay away. I didn't drive by the house. I didn't want to see moving trucks or packing boxes. There was no triumph for me in watching them pack up the remnants of their shattered lives. My victory was in the quiet confirmation of justice, in the silent apology for my father being honored, not in their public humiliation. But the toxic family system wasn't going to die quietly. About a week before the move-out date, I got a call from my Aunt Carol. Her voice, usually so full of false sweetness, was now sharp with panic and accusation. "David, how could you?" she began, without even a hello. "She is your mother. You're throwing your own mother out onto the street. What will people say? Think of the family's reputation." "Aunt Carol," I said, my voice cold and even. "She is the one who did this. Her actions had consequences. That's all. But you can stop it," she pleaded. "You're a beneficiary now. You can tell the trustee you forgive her, that you want her to stay. You need to be the bigger person here, David. For the sake of the family." "The family?" I asked, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "What family is that, exactly? The one that declared me worthless at my father's deathbed? The one that tried to disinherit me and my unborn child? No, thank you. That family is no longer my concern." I told her goodbye and hung up before she could respond. I was done being manipulated. I was done being the bigger person, when that just meant letting them continue to walk all over me. Then, a few days after the deadline had passed, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. It was Mark. His voice was unrecognizable. All the arrogance, the smug superiority that had defined him his entire life, was gone. It was replaced by a hollow, defeated, reedy tone. He asked if we could meet. He just wanted to talk, he said. Against my better judgment, driven by a flicker of morbid curiosity, I agreed. We met at a sterile, anonymous coffee shop, a neutral territory halfway between my warm, happy home and the small, grim apartment complex he and my mother had been forced to rent across town. He looked terrible. He'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, leaving his face looking gaunt and skull-like. There were dark, bruised-looking circles under his eyes, and he was wearing a wrinkled shirt that looked like it had been slept in. The flashy, confident golden child was gone. In his place was just a tired, broken man of 32 who looked 50. We sat in a deeply awkward silence for a few minutes after a cheerful waitress took our order. He just stared into his empty cup, unable to meet my eyes. Finally, he spoke, his voice so low I had to lean in to hear it. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything, Mark," I told him, my voice neutral. "I wasn't there to offer absolution." "No, I do," he said, finally looking up at me. His eyes were filled with a confusing, pathetic mix of resentment and something else I'd never seen in him before. A dawning, bewildered self-awareness. All my life, I never questioned it. Not once. You got the used bike, I got the new car. You got student loans, I got a trip to Europe. It was just the way things were. It was always just there. For me, like the sun rising in the morning. He shook his head, a bitter, self-deprecating smile twisting his lips. I never had to fight for anything. Not once. Mom just handed it all to me on a silver platter. And I took it. I let her tell me it was my right. I let her convince me I was better than you because of it. I treated you like dirt, because I thought that's what you deserved. He took a shaky sip of water. She ruined me, David, he whispered, the words sounding like they were being torn from his throat. All those years, I thought she was building me up, making me into the heir of the family. But she was making me weak. She was hollowing me out. You had to fight for every single thing you ever got. You had to build your own life, your own career, from nothing. And I just floated along on her ambition. Now the money's gone, the house is gone, and I don't know how to do anything. I don't know how to fight. I don't even know where to start. It was, without a doubt, the most honest thing I had ever heard my brother say. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking at my rival. I was looking at another victim of my mother's narcissistic poisoning, just a different kind. I had been the scapegoat, he had been the golden child, but we had both been twisted and damaged by the same toxic source. I felt a pang of something, not quite forgiveness, not even close, but a sad, distant, clinical kind of pity. You'll learn, Mark, I said quietly. You'll have to. That's what starting from nothing is all about. We finished our coffees in a silence that was no longer awkward, just heavy with the weight of a lifetime of unspoken truths. There were no grand apologies, no tearful promises of a new beginning. The damage was too deep, the chasm between our lives too wide for that. But for the first time, there was a sliver of something real, a shared, bitter understanding. We parted ways on the sidewalk with a stiff, formal nod. As I walked back to my car, I felt a strange sense of closure. A few days later, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from my mother. It was the first time she tried to contact me since I'd left her, speechless and ruined, in that conference room. I braced myself for a wave of anger, of guilt-tripping, of blame. But the message was just 3 words. I am sorry. I stared at the text for a long time. 3 words. After a lifetime of damage. It was like trying to patch a Grand Canyon with a single Band-Aid. It was too little, too late. I thought about everything. The years of being made to feel small, the public humiliation at my father's deathbed, the calculated cruelty, the way she had tried to erase my unborn child. I thought about the strong, resilient woman my wife was, and the new, honest life we were building. I took a deep breath. I knew what I had to do, not out of spite, not out of anger, but out of a deep, instinctual need for self-preservation. I typed out a single 2-word reply, a simple acknowledgement of fact. I know. And then, I opened my contacts, found her name, and pressed block. I did the same for Aunt Carol's number. Some doors, once you walk through them and close them behind you, need to be locked, bolted, and never opened again. My old family was a chapter of my life that was now over. It was time to start writing the next one. 1 year. 365 days. It's not a long time in the grand scheme of things, but in the life of a man, it can be an eternity. It can be the span between one life and the next. A year ago, I was a son grieving a father and a family that had brutally and methodically disowned me. Today, I was just a father, and it was the greatest, most fulfilling title I could ever imagine. The scene was our backyard, a place that had become my sanctuary. It wasn't the grand, sprawling lawn of my childhood home, with its professionally manicured hedges and the ghost of a planned-out swimming pool. This was a modest, cozy patch of green behind the new house Sarah and I had bought 6 months ago. It was a house we chose together, a house with good bones and a warm soul, a house we were slowly filling with our own memories, our own traditions, our own laughter. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, charcoal from the barbecue, and the sweet scent of the rose bushes Sarah had planted along the fence. Our daughter, Lily, was celebrating her first birthday. She was a tiny, magnificent whirlwind of pink ribbons, frosting-smeared cheeks, and a smile that could melt glaciers. She was stumbling across the lawn with the determined, wobbly gait of a new walker, a look of intense concentration on her face as she made a beeline for the dog's water bowl. Sarah was chasing after her, laughing, her face glowing with a kind of pure, unadulterated joy that I'd thought was lost to us forever during those long, dark years in sterile clinics. Our friends, our real family, were all around us. Their kids were playing, their joyous shrieks filling the air, the sound a warm, comforting blanket of normalcy and love. This was family. This was real. The court had finalized the distribution of the Collins Family Trust months ago. The numbers were staggering, an amount of money I'd never imagined having. But sitting there on a patio chair, watching my daughter discover the fascinating texture of a blade of grass, I knew with every fiber of my being that the money wasn't the real inheritance. The real inheritance was this: the freedom, the peace, the ability to build this life, a life free from the poison and the judgment of my past. We had decided to use a significant portion of the money to do something that felt right, something that gave meaning to our own struggle. We established the Lily Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing financial grants to families who were buckling under the crushing, often insurmountable, costs of fertility treatments. It was our way of turning our years of private pain into someone else's public hope. On a table near the back door, next to the birthday presents, there was a stack of newly printed brochures for the foundation. On the cover was a beautiful picture of Sarah and me holding our little girl, all three of us smiling. My new legacy, my real legacy. Later that afternoon, after most of the guests had packed up their tired children and left, I was cleaning up the debris of a successful first birthday party. Wrapping paper, paper plates, a half-eaten cake. A delivery truck pulled up, and the driver brought a small, flat box to the front door. It was from Mr. Peterson's law firm. I opened it curiously. Inside, there was a short, typed letter from him. It was warm and personal, congratulating us on Lily's first birthday and wishing our new family a lifetime of happiness. He said my father would have been incredibly proud. Those words meant more to me than he could ever know. But underneath the letter was something else. A thin, leather-bound journal. It was old, the dark brown leather worn smooth and soft with time and touch. With a sense of reverence, I opened it. The inside cover had my grandmother's name, Cecilia Collins, written in an elegant, faded fountain pen ink. It was her journal. Mr. Peterson's note explained that Cecilia had left it in his care years ago, with a peculiar instruction, to give it to her grandchild who, in his judgment, proved to have the most character upon Richard's passing. My throat tightened, and my eyes stung. I spent the next hour sitting on our new porch swing, the chains creaking rhythmically, as I carefully turned the fragile, time-thinned pages. It wasn't a diary of daily events, but a collection of her thoughts, her hopes, her philosophies on life, business, and family. It felt like I was finally meeting the woman who had saved me from beyond the grave, and I was stunned by her wisdom and her foresight. She was a force of nature. One entry, from 1986, just a year after she'd established the trust, jumped out at me as if it were written in neon. "A family is a garden," she'd written. "It is not a monument, built of stone and meant to last forever unchanging. It is a living thing. You can't just expect it to grow. You have to tend to it every day. You have to pull the weeds of resentment, jealousy, and selfishness before they choke the life out of everything good. And you must build it on the strong, rich soil of kindness and integrity, not just on the flimsy trellis of a shared name. A name is nothing but air. Character is the bedrock. It is everything." I closed the journal, feeling a profound, soul-deep sense of peace. She understood. She had seen the potential for weeds in her own family, perhaps even in her own son's marriage, and she had taken steps to protect the future. I hadn't just been fighting for myself and my child. I had been tending my grandmother's garden. I had been fulfilling her legacy. Just as I was about to go inside, my phone buzzed. For the past year, I had maintained a strict no-contact policy. I'd heard through the family grapevine, a network I was no longer officially part of, but whose whispers still reached me, that Mark was working a menial sales job, struggling to make ends meet. I'd heard that my mother was living a quiet, bitter, and lonely life in that small apartment. I felt no joy in their downfall, but I felt no pity either. They were living with the consequences of their choices, just as I was living with the beautiful consequences of mine. But this new notification, it wasn't a text. It was an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was just my name, David. With a sense of trepidation, I opened it. The email was short. I know you have blocked my number. I don't blame you. I have attached a letter. That is all. It was signed simply Eleanor. My heart hammered against my ribs. Attached was a single image file. A scanned letter, handwritten on plain, cheap-looking stationery. The handwriting was shaky, the loops and curls less confident than I remembered, but it was unmistakably my mother's. It wasn't a long letter. It wasn't filled with the excuses or blame-shifting I would have expected. It was just a few simple, devastating sentences. David, there are no words in the English language to say how sorry I am for the pain I have caused you. I was wrong. I see that now, in the silence of my life. I was blinded by my own pride and a deep, ugly fear I didn't even understand. I broke our family because I was too weak to see what it was truly made of. I know I don't deserve to ask you anything. I have no right, but I have to ask. My lawyer sent a picture of your daughter from the foundation's website. Lily. It's a beautiful name. Does she look like you? Your mother, Eleanor. I stared at the image of the letter on my phone for what felt like an eternity. A year ago, this letter would have been impossible. It was a crack in the mountain of her narcissism. A tiny, flickering candle of remorse in a lifetime of darkness. It was the question of a grandmother, not a matriarch. Sarah came out onto the porch and sat beside me, resting her head on my shoulder. She saw the image on my phone. She read the words slowly. She didn't say anything, just waited, giving me the space to process it. What do you do with something like that? How do you respond to an apology that can never undo the decades of damage, but seems, for the very first time, to be painfully, heartbreakingly genuine? I thought of my grandmother's words. A garden you have to tend. Pulling weeds was one thing. That was survival. But what about planting a new seed? Not in the old poisoned soil, but in a new, separate pot far away, to see if it might one day grow. I didn't reply to the email. The silence was my answer for now. But I didn't delete it either. I saved the image to my phone. Later that evening, I printed a copy of the letter. I folded it carefully, and I slipped it into the very back of my grandmother's journal. I closed the book, a silent acknowledgement that both stories, the story of my grandmother's wisdom and the story of my mother's remorse, were now part of my history. One was a foundation, the other a cautionary tale. Forgiveness, I was beginning to realize, wasn't a single act, a switch you could flip. Maybe it was a long, slow, quiet journey. Maybe it was a choice you have to make over and over again. And maybe, just maybe, it was a gate I could choose to unlock one day, far in the future, when the wounds had finally turned into scars. But not today. Today was for my family. My real family. My wife and my daughter. My garden. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I hope it resonated with you in some way. Took a lot for me to share this, but I felt it was important to get it out there. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to fight for what was right, even when it was against the people you were supposed to trust the most? I'd be honored to read your experiences. Please share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss what I have to share next.